Imagine being forgotten, not just ignored, but literally erased from the world above while you're still breathing. In 1300, a prison wasn't a place for rehabilitation. It was a waiting room for the grave. You're standing in an oubliette from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. There are no beds, no windows, just the stench of rot and the sound of rats waiting for you to stop moving. In here, time doesn't exist. Only the cold, the hunger, and a darkness so thick it feels like it's choking you. Most people think that torture was the worst part. They're wrong. The real horror was the silence. It was so unbearable that men didn't pray for freedom anymore. Tonight, we step into the deepest holes of the Middle Ages to find out why. In the 14th century, a quick execution was considered a mercy, and why life inside these walls was a fate far worse than death. Welcome back to the Midnight Historian. Let me ask you something real quick. If you were locked in a medieval prison in the 1300s, what do you think you'd be praying for? Freedom? A miracle? A pardon from the king? Here's the part that messes with your head. Most prisoners didn't pray for release. They prayed for death, and not in a dramatic, poetic way. I mean literally begging God to let them die before morning. Because in the 1300s, prison wasn't a punishment meant to correct you. It wasn't a place where you served time and walked out wiser. Prison was a place where society put you to rot. And everyone, including the guards, fully expected you not to survive. Here's the first shocking fact most people don't realize. Medieval prisons were not designed to keep people alive. They were holding pens, temporary cages. You were thrown inside while the authorities decided whether to fine you, torture you, ransom you, or execute you. Survival was not part of the plan. Imagine being dragged underground, the door slamming shut behind you, and instantly knowing something terrifying. No one has any incentive to keep you alive. Food was optional. Clean water was a luxury. Medical care, forget it. Even sunlight was considered unnecessary. Most prisons were old towers, castle basements, abandoned Roman ruins, or converted city gates. They weren't built for humans. They were built for stone and weapons. The walls leaked constantly. Rainwater seeped through cracks, pooling on the floor. Prisoners slept in mud, standing water, or their own waste. And yes, that's literal. Now, here's where it gets worse. You weren't usually alone. Cells were overcrowded to a level that modern people genuinely can't imagine. Dozens of bodies pressed together in pitch darkness, chained or unchained depending on the mood of the jailer. If one person got sick, and they always did, everyone got sick. Diseases like dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis, and something ominously called jail fever spread fast and killed faster. Shocking fact, jail fever wasn't a single disease. It was a lethal mix of typhus, lice, infestations, starvation, and filth, and it killed prisoners, guards, judges, and sometimes entire courtrooms after trials. In some cases, judges literally died because they came too close to prisoners during sentencing. Food. Let's talk about food, because this part alone explains why people prayed for death. Most prisons did not provide meals at all. Read that again. If you had money, family, or friends. They could bring you bread, water, or scraps. If you didn't, you starved. Slowly, publicly, quietly. Bread, when it existed, was moldy and crawling with insects. Water was stagnant and shared with rats. Some prisoners drank from puddles on the floor. Others licked moisture off stone walls. Starvation wasn't accidental, it was leverage. Jailers charged fees for everything. Chains, bedding, light, even the removal of corpses. And yes, corpses often stayed in the cell. Here's another fact that sounds fake, but isn't. Dead prisoners were sometimes left chained next to the living for days. Why? Because unchaining a body costs money. And if no one paid, the body stayed. Now imagine this. You're weak, starving, sick, lying on cold stone, listening to rats fight over scraps, breathing air thick with decay, and you realize something horrifyingly logical. Death would be easier. This is why prisoners prayed, not for mercy, but for an ending. Religious belief made it even more complicated. Medieval Christians believed suffering could purify the soul, but they also believed dying without confession, sacraments, or proper burial could doom you eternally. Prisoners were trapped between physical agony and spiritual terror. Some begged priests to visit. Others begged God to kill them after confession, but before madness or disease took over. And madness was common. Extended darkness breaks the human mind. Many cells had no light at all. Prisoners lost track of time. Days blended into weeks. People hallucinated. Some screamed until their voices failed. Others went completely silent. Assigned guards recognized as close to death. Shocking fact, some medieval prisoners deliberately injured themselves, breaking limbs or reopening wounds, just to feel something other than hunger and despair. And if you think, well, at least innocent people were safe, think again. Debtors, political enemies, unlucky travelers, women accused of adultery, heresy, or witchcraft, many were imprisoned without trial for months or years. There was no fixed sentence, no release date, just waiting, waiting to die, waiting to be forgotten. So when you see medieval records saying, prisoners prayed for death, it's not metaphorical. It's not exaggeration. It's a rational response to a system where death was often the most merciful outcome available. And this is only the beginning, because in the next chapter, we're going underground into the darkest cells. The oubliettes places so cruel that even medieval people whispered about them in fear. Here's the moment that broke most medieval prisoners, and it wasn't the chains, the hunger, or even the darkness. It was the realization that no one was coming. At first, almost everyone believed their situation was temporary. A few days, they told themselves, a week, maybe. They assumed there would be a hearing, a ransom, a decision. After all, that's how justice works, right? Except in the 1300s, justice wasn't a system. It was a mood, a convenience, sometimes a rumor. Days passed, then weeks. The guards stopped responding when prisoners shouted. Food deliveries, if they ever existed, became irregular. Names were forgotten. Paperwork disappeared. And slowly the truth sank in. You were no longer a person. You were a problem that had been locked away. This is when hope didn't just fade, it collapsed. Medieval prisons operated on silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, suffocating kind that presses into your skull. No clocks, no calendars, no way to mark time except by the slow deterioration of your own body. Prisoners counted days by hunger pains, by infections spreading, by how long it took someone to die in the corner. Shocking fact, some prisoners marked time by counting corpses. 1, 2, 3. Each death wasn't shocking anymore. It was informative. It told you how long a human body could last in this place. And here's something deeply unsettling. Guards often encouraged despair, not out of cruelty, but efficiency. A hopeless prisoner was quieter, less resistant, easier to manage. Jailers learned that breaking someone mentally reduced the chance of rebellion or escape attempts. They lied casually. You'll be released soon. The judge asked about you. Someone paid your fee. None of it had to be true. There was no accountability. And prisoners clung to those lies like oxygen, until the day they realized the lies never turned into reality. That's when prayers changed. Early prayers were desperate bargains. God, if you free me, I'll repent. If I survive, I'll donate. I'll change. Later, prayers became quieter, simpler. Please let this end. Because starvation doesn't kill you quickly. It eats you in stages. First comes weakness, then dizziness, then confusion. Muscles shrink, vision blurs. Your heartbeat feels wrong, too slow, then too fast. Eventually, even standing becomes exhausting. Shocking fact, medieval prisoners sometimes died standing up, too weak to sit, too crowded to lie down. And disease didn't arrive dramatically. It crept in through small cuts, lice, bites, infected sores. Fevers came with hallucinations. Prisoners spoke to people who weren't there. Some believed angels were visiting. Others believed demons were dragging them to hell already. And in a deeply religious world that mattered, fear of hell was real. Eternal punishment was more terrifying than starvation. Some prisoners believed prison itself was a test, that enduring it silently would save their soul. Others believed the opposite, that prison was proof God had abandoned them. This spiritual confusion was agony. Shocking fact, some prisoners begged fellow inmates to confess their sins to them, because priests never came. And that brings us to another brutal reality. Priests were often afraid to enter prisons, not because of violence, but because of disease. Jail fever was infamous. Clergy avoided prisons unless paid, and if no one paid, you died without confession, without last rites, without absolution. To a medieval mind, that was worse than death itself. This is when prisoners began to pray not just for death, but for a specific kind of death, a clean one, a sudden one, something that wouldn't involve madness, filth, or spiritual uncertainty. Some begged for execution. Execution, at least, meant witnesses, a priest, a known ending. It meant your body wouldn't dissolve anonymously in a dark hole. It meant someone would remember your name, even briefly. And here's the darkest irony of all. Execution was often a mercy, compared to imprisonment. Hanging was quick. Beheading was faster if done right. Even burning, horrific as it was, ended suffering in minutes compared to weeks or months of decay behind stone walls. Prisoners knew this, so when records mentioned people confessing eagerly or welcoming judgment, it wasn't guilt speaking. It was exhaustion. It was someone choosing the lesser horror. And not everyone waited. Shocking fact. Suicide attempts in medieval prisons were common and punished severely if failed. Surviving a suicide attempt could lead to torture, extended imprisonment, or denial of burial rights after death. Yet people still tried. That alone tells you how unbearable life inside those walls was. By the end, many prisoners stopped eating even when food appeared. They turned their faces to the wall. They whispered prayers under their breath, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be heard by a God they weren't sure was listening anymore. And somewhere above them, life went on. Markets opened, churches rang bells, children played in streets built directly over prisons full of people quietly, disappearing from history. This is why medieval prisons didn't need guards with weapons. The system itself did the killing, and we haven't even reached the places that were designed specifically to make people vanish, because next we're going to talk about the prison where hope didn't even get the courtesy of dying slowly. There were prisons, and then there were places designed to erase you. If chapter 1 was about suffering, chapter 2 is about disappearance. Because sometime in the Middle Ages, someone in power had a realization that still feels chilling today. The most effective prison isn't the one that punishes loudly. It's the one that makes people vanish quietly. And that's where the oubliette comes in. You've probably heard the word before. It sounds almost elegant, almost harmless. But the word comes from the French oublier, to forget. An oubliette wasn't just a cell. It was a statement. You weren't sent there to wait. You weren't sent there to be judged. You were sent there to be forgotten. An oubliette was usually a vertical pit, carved into stone, sometimes dozens of feet deep. No door, no stairs, just a hole in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered down by rope or dropped. Once inside, there was no way out, no ladder, no footholds. Sometimes not even enough space to stand fully upright. The opening above was sealed, and that was it. Shocking fact, many oubliettes had no record of who was inside them. Not even guards knew the names. Food, if provided at all, was lowered randomly. Some days you ate. Some days you didn't. Water dripped from stone walls or pooled at the bottom, mixed with waste, blood, and rock. Light was almost non-existent. You lived in permanent twilight or total darkness. And here's the part that really messes with retention psychology. People didn't scream in oubliettes for long. Screaming requires energy, hope, and expectation of being heard. Once prisoners realized sound didn't travel upward, silence took over. And silence, prolonged silence, does something terrifying to the human brain. Without light, without sound, without social interaction, the mind starts to turn inward. Thoughts loop. Memories distort. Time collapses. Prisoners lost the ability to tell whether minutes or days had passed. Shocking fact, Some medieval texts describe prisoners who forgot their own names before they died. Imagine that. Your body still exists, but your identity dissolves before death even arrives. And death didn't come quickly. People assume oubliettes were execution devices. They weren't. Execution is decisive. Oubliettes were slow, uncertain, and psychologically devastating. Some prisoners survived weeks, some months, a few disturbingly lasted years. How? Because humans can endure horrifying conditions if there's even the smallest illusion of survival. Dripping water, mold scraped from walls, insects, rats, anything became food. But the cost was immense. Shocking fact, archaeologists have found oubliette remains with bones, showing signs of self-mutilation, fingers gnawed, limbs injured, likely attempts to cope with sensory deprivation or pain. And then there's the smell. People forget about smell when they imagine medieval prisons. But smell was constant, overpowering, inescapable, inoubliable. There was no airflow, no waste removal. Everything stayed, every bodily function, every infection, every corpse. Yes, corpses. If someone died before you, they stayed with you. You lived beside decay, slept beside it, sometimes leaned against it in the dark without realizing until the smell changed. At some point, prisoners stopped praying for release. They stopped praying for food. Their prayers became abstract, fragmented sentences whispered into darkness. Please, enough, now. And this is where medieval belief makes it worse. Many prisoners believed dying in an oubliette meant dying. Outside of society, outside God's order, no witnesses, no burial, no acknowledgement that terrified them more than pain. To die unremembered was to die twice. This fear is why rumors spread so fast. Stories circulated of people thrown into oubliettes for minor offenses, for speaking too freely, for angering the wrong noble, for knowing something dangerous. Truth barely mattered. Fear did. Shocking fact. Some castles built oubliettes, even when they didn't legally need prisons, purely as a deterrent. You didn't need to know what happened inside. The existence of the hole was enough. And sometimes oubliettes weren't underground at all. In some places, prisoners were sealed inside wall cavities, hidden chambers, forgotten rooms behind altars or staircases. They weren't meant to be accessed again. Renovations centuries later uncovered skeletons still chained in place. No records, no trials, just remains. Now pause for a second. Imagine knowing that these places existed, and knowing that being sent there meant society had already decided you no longer mattered, that your life was so inconvenient it could be erased without explanation. That's when death stops being scary. That's when prisoners stopped fearing the end and started fearing the wait. And here's the most chilling part of all. Not everyone sent to oubliettes was guilty. Some were political pawns. Some were relatives of enemies. Some were witnesses. Some were simply inconvenient. Which means that somewhere in the 1300s, people prayed for death not because they deserved punishment, but because they were trapped in a system that had no exit. And this is still only the infrastructure. There was a moment inside oubliettes and deep medieval prisons that survivors The very few who made it out described in the same unsettling way. They said there was a point where pain stopped being the worst part. Not because it went away, but because something else replaced it. That moment was when prisoners stopped feeling human. At first, suffering was loud, hunger screamed, fear raced through the body. The mind fought constantly, replaying memories, imagining rescue, rehearsing conversations that would never happen. Prisoners clung to identity, names, faces, who they used to be. But over time, something terrifying happened. The brain adapted. Without light, routine, or social contact, the mind began to conserve energy. Thoughts shortened. Emotions dulled. Hope didn't shatter. It quietly shut down, like a candle suffocating in stale air. Shocking fact. Medieval jailers noticed that prisoners became easier after a certain number of weeks, quieter, slower, compliant. They called it settling. Today, we'd call it psychological collapse. Prisoners stopped reacting to screams, stopped flinching at death, stopped caring when food didn't arrive. Some even forgot hunger entirely. Their bodies starving while their minds drifted, somewhere numb and unreachable. And this numbness scared them, because medieval belief taught that emotions, fear, regret, remorse were signs of a soul still fighting. Losing them felt like losing salvation itself. Some prisoners panicked when they realized they felt nothing. They pinched themselves, scratched at skin, whispered prayers louder than necessary, anything to confirm they were still alive inside. Others leaned into the numbness. They lay still for hours, sometimes days, barely breathing, barely blinking. Guards occasionally thought they were dead, until an eye opened slowly in the dark. This state was so common that it appears in multiple medieval records, described vaguely as melancholy, madness, or withdrawal of spirit. Shocking fact. Some prisoners refused rescue. Attempts because they no longer understood what freedom meant. Imagine that. A rope lowered, a voice calling, and the person below doesn't move, not because they're chained, but because the concept of leaving no longer exists in their mind. And then there's the body. The human body in those conditions didn't decay evenly. Teeth loosened, gums bled, hair fell out in patches, skin cracked and split, infections spread unchecked, wounds that would have healed in days became fatal. Prisoners smelled death on themselves long before it arrived. They became aware of their own decomposition, and that awareness alone pushed many toward prayer for death, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. Shocking fact. Medieval texts describe prisoners asking guards to kill them, not angrily, but politely, please. Do it now. End this. Guards often ignored them, not out of mercy, but indifference. And this is where cruelty becomes terrifyingly quiet. Most jailers weren't sadists. They didn't torture prisoners for pleasure. They simply stopped seeing them as people. Prisoners were maintenance problems, costs, background noise. If someone died, it meant one less mouth to worry about. If someone begged, it meant nothing. And over time, this emotional detachment became institutional. Shocking fact, Some medieval cities budgeted prisons assuming a certain percentage of prisoners would die before trial. Death wasn't a failure of the system. It was the system. Inside oubliettes, this detachment reached its final form. Prisoners lost track of seasons, of years, of age. Some forgot their own crimes. Others invented reasons just to make sense of suffering. I must have done something terrible, they thought. God wouldn't allow this otherwise. That belief crushed what little resistance remained. Because once you believe you deserve what's happening to you, the fight ends. And that's when prayers changed one last time. They stopped asking God why. They stopped asking God how long. They asked when. When will this stop? When will I sleep? When will you take me? And sometimes, disturbingly, death didn't answer. Some prisoners lingered in a half-alive state for months, barely conscious, barely responsive, existing just enough to suffer, not enough to die. Medieval people had a word for this state: living death. And that phrase haunted them, because to a medieval mind, living death meant being trapped between worlds, neither alive nor properly dead. It was the worst possible outcome. That's why execution, public, final witnessed, felt merciful by comparison. And this is the mindset prisoners carried with them into the next phase of medieval punishment, because prisons weren't the end. They were the waiting room. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about what happened when prisoners were finally brought out of the dark, not into freedom, but into judgment, and why many walked toward execution calmer than they ever were in prison. That's where the psychology flips completely, okay? This is where things get really unsettling, because if you ever wonder how bad medieval prisons actually were, here's the clearest answer. People walked toward execution calmer than they had been in months. Not screaming, not fighting, not begging. Some were relieved. I know that sounds impossible, but stay with me. Imagine spending weeks, sometimes months, in darkness, starving, sick, half-mad, with no idea if today is your last day or just another slow decay. Now imagine a guard suddenly opens the door and says, "You're being taken out." That moment should feel hopeful, right? But for many prisoners, it didn't mean freedom. It meant judgment. And weirdly enough, judgment felt better than waiting. Here's a fact that always stops people medieval execution days were sometimes quieter than prison corridors. Prisoners had already processed their fear back in the cell. By the time they were dragged outside, fear had burned itself out. What remained was something closer to acceptance or even peace. And no, this wasn't bravery. It was exhaustion. When prisoners were brought into the light for the first time in weeks, some physically their eyes couldn't handle it. Their bodies shook, but mentally something clicked. For the first time in a long time, things were clear. There was a place, a time, an outcome. That alone felt merciful. Comma. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Execution meant attention. People looked at you. A priest spoke to you. Someone said your name out loud. You weren't invisible anymore. You weren't rotting in a hole that no one acknowledged. And to someone who had been forgotten, that mattered more than survival. Some prisoners even thanked their executioners. I wish that was an exaggeration. Records mention condemned prisoners asking executioners to do it cleanly or do it well, not angrily, calmly, like they were negotiating the end of a long illness, because compared to prison, execution was fast. Even the worst methods ended suffering, quicker than weeks of starvation and madness. And here's the part most people don't expect. Some prisoners feared being spared. Imagine hearing that your sentence had been reduced, that you were being sent back to prison instead of executed. That should be good news, right? For many, it was horrifying. Back to the darkness, back to waiting, back to uncertainty. Death had a date. Prison didn't. This mindset didn't come from courage. It came from being broken slowly and completely. Medieval prisons trained people to see death as structure and life as chaos. And that psychological flip, it wasn't accidental. Authorities knew exactly what they were doing. Long imprisonment softened resistance. By the time judgment arrived, prisoners were compliant, quiet, less likely to cause trouble, less likely to resist publicly. Shocking fact, prolonged imprisonment was sometimes used intentionally to make executions smoother, and when people in power realized this worked, they kept doing it. This is also where public execution became almost theatrical, not for entertainment, but control. People watching saw condemned prisoners walking calmly to their deaths, confessing, praying, accepting judgment. It sent a message. This is what happens when the system finishes with you. What they didn't see was the prison that came before. The darkness, the starvation, the slow unmaking of a human being. And here's the quietest, most disturbing detail of all. Some prisoners didn't even remember why they were being executed. They confessed anyway, not because they were guilty, but because confession meant closure. That's how deep the damage went. So when you hear medieval sources describing condemned prisoners as peaceful or repentant, don't mistake that for moral victory. It was psychological defeat. And the tragedy is, society mistook that defeat for justice. Now here's where the story takes another turn. Because not everyone who survived prison went to execution. Some were released, and you'd think freedom would fix everything. It didn't. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about what happened to the people who actually made it out alive, and why many of them wished they hadn't. This is where the damage becomes permanent. Here's something medieval records almost whisper instead of stating directly. Surviving prison didn't mean surviving the damage. For the few prisoners who were released instead of executed, freedom didn't feel like relief. It felt confusing, disorienting, sometimes terrifying. Imagine stepping out of a dark cell after months or years and suddenly being told, you're free, no explanation, no help, just go. The world kept moving while you were frozen in decay, and now you were expected to rejoin it like nothing happened. Many former prisoners couldn't handle open spaces. Sounds felt violent. Sunlight hurt. Crowds triggered panic. Some refused to sleep indoors. Others refused to sleep at all. Their bodies were free, but their minds were still underground. And here's the brutal part. Medieval society had no concept of trauma. If you couldn't function, you weren't injured, you were weak. or cursed, or broken by God. Shocking fact, some released prisoners voluntarily returned to prisons, monasteries or hospitals because confinement felt safer than freedom. Think about that for a second. After surviving starvation, darkness, and death, open life felt more threatening than a cell. That tells you everything you need to know about what prison did to people. And it didn't stop there. Former prisoners were often marked, not officially, but socially. People knew where you'd been. Employers avoided you. Neighbors whispered. Family relationships were strained or completely severed. In a deeply religious society, imprisonment carried moral suspicion. Even if you were innocent, people assumed you must have done something to deserve it. That shame stuck. This is why execution sometimes felt cleaner. It ended the story. Release forced you to live with it. Some survivors described feeling like ghosts, alive but detached. They struggled to feel joy, fear, or purpose. Food tasted strange. Silence felt louder than prison noise. Nightmares were constant. Many turned intensely religious, clinging to rituals because structure felt familiar. Others abandoned faith entirely, believing God had already made his judgment underground. Shocking fact, medieval chroniclers mention former prisoners who stopped speaking altogether after release. Not because they couldn't, but because words felt unnecessary, even dangerous. Silence had kept them alive, so they stayed silent. This is where the psychology of death becomes even darker. For prisoners who had mentally prepared themselves to die, release felt like being pulled backward from a conclusion they'd already accepted. Death had become organized in their minds. Life was chaos. That reversal was destabilizing, and medieval authorities noticed this too. Released prisoners were rarely compensated, rarely rehabilitated, often pushed back into poverty, which meant many were arrested again. Debt, vagrancy, minor offenses, the system recycled people it had already damaged. So when you read about medieval prisoners welcoming death, it wasn't just about avoiding pain. It was about avoiding an afterlife of damage. Execution meant finality. Release meant uncertainty layered on top of trauma. And here's the quietest, saddest truth hiding in the records. Some prisoners asked judges to change their sentence back to death. Not publicly, not dramatically, in private, calmly, because they knew what waited for them outside, and they knew they didn't have the strength to face it. This is why medieval prisons were more than punishment. They were transformation machines. They didn't just confine body. They rewired minds. By the time judgment arrived, people were no longer the same beings who had entered those walls. And that's why the system worked. Because a broken person doesn't resist. They comply, they accept, they disappear quietly, whether through execution, exile, or slow fading into society's margins. And now that you understand what prison did to individuals, we need to zoom out, because none of this happened by accident. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about why medieval society accepted this level of suffering, how religion, power, and fear fused together, and why almost no one questioned it. That's where the story becomes uncomfortable for us to, okay, here's the part where people usually ask, but why didn't anyone stop this? And honestly, That's the most modern question you could ask. Because in the 1300s, medieval prisons weren't seen as cruel. They were seen as inevitable, necessary, even righteous. And once you understand how people thought back then, it gets disturbing fast. First thing you have to remember, medieval society was built on hierarchy. God at the top, kings below him, nobles under kings, common people at the bottom. Justice wasn't about fairness. It was about order. Anything that threatened order, crime, debt, dissent, even inconvenience, had to be contained. Prison wasn't about correcting behavior, it was about removing disorder from sight. And religion didn't fight this idea, it reinforced it. People genuinely believed suffering had meaning. Pain wasn't random, it was instructional. If you suffered, it meant God was teaching you something or punishing you, so when someone was thrown into a dungeon and wasted away, the assumption wasn't this is wrong, it was this must be deserved. Shocking fact, medieval sermons sometimes described prison suffering as a preview of hell, meant to scare others into obedience. That's not the metaphor, that was the point. So when prisoners prayed for death, society didn't see that as a failure of justice. They saw it as proof the system worked. Fear kept people in line. Silence kept cities stable. And here's something that feels uncomfortable even now. Most people didn't want to know what prisons were like. The darkness was intentional. Out of sight, out of mind. As long as prisoners were hidden underground, society could pretend order was being maintained cleanly. Public executions were visible. Prisons were not. That wasn't an accident. Executions told a story. Prisons erased one. Another reason no one intervened. Responsibility was fragmented. Guards blamed judges. Judges blamed laws. Laws blamed God. And God, of course, couldn't be questioned. Cruelty didn't belong to one person. It belonged to the system, which meant no one felt personally guilty. Shocking fact, medieval jailers were often paid per prisoner, per chain, per lock, but not for keeping anyone alive. Survival was literally unpaid labor. And then there's fear. Real fear. People knew how easy it was to fall into prison. A debt, a bad harvest, saying the wrong thing to the wrong person, helping the wrong neighbor. When the line between free and imprisoned is thin, you don't protest. You stay quiet. You stay agreeable. You stay invisible. So when someone disappeared into a cell, neighbors didn't ask questions. Asking questions meant drawing attention. Attention was dangerous. This created a culture where praying for death made sense. Not just for prisoners, but as a concept. Life under constant fear wasn't romanticized. Endurance was praised. Survival wasn't guaranteed. Death, at least, was final. And here's the most chilling realization. Medieval society didn't see prisons as temporary mistakes. They saw them as background machinery, like walls, like taxes, like disease, something unpleasant but unavoidable. That's why reform didn't come for centuries. Not because people were stupid, not because they were heartless, but because the system aligned perfectly with what they believed about power, God, and human worth. And if that's making you a little uncomfortable, good, because this is where history starts reflecting back at us. Because in the next chapter, we're going to talk about how these prisons didn't just affect criminals, they shaped how society understood suffering itself, and how traces of that mindset still exist today. Here's something medieval society understood instinctively. Even if they never said it out loud, mercy was risky. Cruelty was predictable. Once you start showing mercy, you open the door to questions, and questions threaten order. So the system learned to treat mercy like a weakness rather than a virtue. If a prisoner suffered quietly, that was proof of guilt or divine will. If they cried out and someone intervened, that intervention itself became suspicious. Why help that person? What made them special? Favoritism was dangerous in a world obsessed with hierarchy. Equal cruelty felt safer than selective kindness. This is why rules stayed vague. Laws weren't meant to protect individuals. They were meant to protect authority. Ambiguity allowed power to bend outcomes without explanation. Prison fit perfectly into that logic. No deadlines, no standards, no accountability. Just waiting. And people internalized this mindset early. Children grew up hearing stories about dungeons, oubliettes, and prisoners who vanished. These weren't horror stories, they were warnings. Behave or you disappear. That lesson settled deep. Shocking fact, some medieval parents threatened misbehaving children with prison imagery long before they understood death. Fear education started young. Mercy also clashed with theology. Forgiveness was God's domain, not society's. Humans were not expected to be kind. They were expected to be obedient. If God wanted someone spared, he would act. Until then, suffering was allowed to continue. So when prisoners prayed for death, society didn't rush to save them. In fact, many believed ending suffering early interfered with divine justice. Letting someone die slowly felt more correct than stepping in. This created a strange moral inversion. Prolonged suffering was seen as morally neutral, sometimes even virtuous, while intervention felt arrogant. And over time, this thinking hardened. Prisons became symbols, not of justice, but of consequence. You didn't need to know who was inside or why. The existence of suffering itself maintained order. People behaved because they were afraid of the unknown behind stone walls, which leads to something deeply unsettling. Many medieval people preferred that prisons remain terrifying. If conditions improved, fear weakened. If fear weakened, control weakened. So neglect wasn't an accident. It was maintenance. Shocking fact, some cities rejected prison. Improvements because harshness discouraged crime. This logic was accepted without question. And here's the quiet psychological cost. Empathy eroded. When suffering becomes normal, compassion feels disruptive. People learned to look away, to rationalize, to trust the system more than their instincts. This is why no mass outrage happened, no reform movements, no collective guilt. The cruelty was spread thin across society until no one felt responsible. Prisoners praying for death weren't seen as victims. They were seen as reminders of what happened when you stepped out of line. And once a society reaches that point, cruelty doesn't need enforcers. It sustains itself, which brings us to the final shift. because eventually even medieval people began to feel something was wrong. Not morally, but practically. Too many deaths, too much instability, too many bodies, and that discomfort didn't come from empathy. It came from fear of chaos. In the next chapter, we'll talk about what finally forced change, and why reform wasn't about kindness at all, but about control evolving. That's where the story turns. Quietly, so here's the twist most people don't expect. Medieval prisons didn't start changing because people suddenly cared. Reform didn't come from compassion. It came from fear, but a different kind of fear. By the late Middle Ages, authorities started noticing something inconvenient. Prisons weren't just killing prisoners, they were destabilizing cities. Jail fever didn't stay underground. It spread, judges died, guards died, clergy died, entire court sessions collapsed, because everyone got sick after contact with prisoners. Suddenly, the suffering behind walls wasn't contained anymore. That's when concern appeared, not for prisoners, but for everyone else. Shocking fact: some medieval courts temporarily halted imprisonments not because they were cruel, but because judges kept dying after trials. When the system started hurting the people at the top, the system paid attention. Another issue was economic. Dead prisoners couldn't pay fines, couldn't be ransomed, couldn't be used as leverage. A living prisoner, even a miserable one, still had value. A dead one was a loss. Slowly, painfully, authorities realized that letting everyone rot wasn't efficient, and medieval systems cared deeply about efficiency, so changes were framed carefully, not as mercy, as order. Better ventilation wasn't humane, it prevented disease outbreaks. Regular food wasn't kindness, it kept prisoners alive long enough to extract payment or confession. Light wasn't psychological care, it reduced madness and violence. The language mattered. If reform had been presented as compassion, it would have been rejected, but presented as control, accepted. Shocking fact: some early prison improvements were justified as protecting guards, not prisoners. This is also when prisons began shifting. Purpose, slowly, unevenly. They weren't just holding cells anymore. They became tools to manage populations, debtors, the poor, the unwanted. Confinement started replacing execution, not because life was valued more, but because death was messy and unpredictable. And yet, the old mindset never fully disappeared. Conditions improved in some places and stayed horrific in others. Oubliettes didn't vanish overnight. Starvation didn't stop instantly. Psychological damage was still ignored. Survival didn't mean recovery. So for many prisoners, praying for death still made sense, even as reforms crept in. And here's the uncomfortable part for us. The logic that shaped medieval prisons didn't die with them. The idea that suffering deters disorder, that fear maintains control, that efficiency matters more than humanity. Those ideas just changed uniforms, which is why this story doesn't end in the Middle Ages. Because when you strip away stone walls and chains, the question underneath stays the same. How much suffering is a society willing to tolerate as long as it stays out of sight? And that brings us to the final chapters. because now we need to talk about memory, about who got remembered and who vanished completely, and why praying for death sometimes felt like the only way to leave a mark at all. That's where this becomes the quietest chapter of all. Here's something medieval records hint at, but rarely say directly. When prisons slowly became less deadly, not everyone felt relieved. For some prisoners, surviving longer didn't feel like mercy. It felt like an extension of punishment. You weren't dying anymore, you were lingering. When minimal reforms arrived, they didn't restore dignity. They just delayed the inevitable. Prisoners were kept alive enough to wait. Wait for judgment. Wait for payment. Wait for decisions made far above them. And waiting, as you already know, was the most damaging part. Food arrived more regularly in some places, but it was still barely enough. Light existed, but only dimly. Disease spread more slowly, not less. The suffering became quieter, and quieter suffering is easier to ignore. Shocking fact: medieval officials sometimes described improved prisons as calm. Not better, calm meant fewer screams. And here's where the psychology twisted again. When death became less immediate, hope returned briefly. And hope, after prolonged trauma, can hurt more than despair. Because hope reopens fear. It makes every delay feel personal. Every silence feels intentional. Some prisoners who had already accepted death now had to relearn uncertainty. They'd made peace with dying. Now they had to face living without knowing how long the waiting would last. Days stretched, weeks dragged, and the mental damage deepened in a different way. This is when prisoners started praying for death again. Not because conditions were worse, but because they were endless. Survival without purpose became its own punishment, and society didn't know what to do with these people. They weren't martyrs. They weren't criminals worth executing. They were inconvenient survivors. So the system stalled. Paperwork delayed. Trials postponed. Decisions deferred. Time did the work instead. Shocking fact: some prisoners were held so long that the original charges were forgotten. But release still didn't happen because no one wanted responsibility. Living people became administrative problems. And that's when prayer shifted one final time. It wasn't desperate anymore. It was resigned, quiet, almost routine. Prisoners prayed the way people checked the weather without expectation. Just habit. Today, not today. Death became a possibility again. Not terrifying, not comforting, just neutral. A door that might open eventually. And this is where medieval prisons reached their most efficient form. Not the bloodiest, not the cruelest, the most psychologically draining. A system where suffering blended into time itself. And that's the dangerous part. Because when suffering becomes normal, it stops triggering urgency. It stops demanding action. It just exists. That's why reform took centuries. Not because people didn't know prisons were horrible, but because they learned to live with that knowledge. And prisoners learned something too. That praying for death wasn't about escape anymore. It was about control. The last thing they could still choose, and in a place designed to strip every choice away that mattered more than survival. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about memory, who was remembered, who was erased, and why, for many prisoners, death felt like the only way to prove they had ever existed at all. That's where this story gets very quiet. Let's talk about something people almost never think about when they imagine medieval prisons. Memory, not history books, not records, just being remembered at all. Because for many prisoners in the 1300s, the most terrifying thought wasn't dying. It was disappearing without proof they'd ever existed. Most prisoners weren't famous. They weren't nobles. They didn't have families who could read or write or bribe officials to keep records. If you vanished into a prison, your name could vanish with you. No letters, no graves, no mention, just absence, and absence was final. Medieval prisons were full of people who realized something slowly and painfully. If they died quietly in a cell, no one would know. No bells, no witnesses, no prayers spoken out loud. Their life would end without ceremony. And in a religious world obsessed with legacy and salvation, that was horrifying. Shocking fact, many prisoners believed dying unseen meant dying without spiritual acknowledgement which could affect their soul's fate. So here's the grim logic that formed in their minds. Execution, as awful as it was, meant visibility. Someone would say your name. A priest might speak to you. A crowd would see you. Your death would be noticed. You would leave a mark, even if it was brief. Prison didn't offer that. That's why some prisoners confessed to crimes they didn't commit. Not because they were guilty, but because confession led to judgment. Judgment led to an ending, and an ending meant memory. Others refused release because freedom meant anonymity. Walking away quietly felt like being erased twice, once by prison, once by history. And think about how devastating that is. To prefer death because it proves you were real. Some prisoners scratched names into stone. Others carved prayers, symbols, dates, anything that could survive them. Archaeologists still find these marks today. Desperate attempts to say, "I was here." Shocking fact, many prison carvings are not pleased for freedom, but declarations of identity, names, hometowns, family members. That tells you what mattered most at the end. And when prisoners prayed for death, part of that prayer wasn't about pain. It was about meaning. They didn't want their suffering to be pointless. They wanted it to count for something, even if that something was just being remembered for a moment. Society unintentionally reinforced this. Executed prisoners entered stories, warnings, sermons. Prisoners who died quietly underground entered nothing. Silence swallowed them whole. So death became a form of agency. The last decision a prisoner could make was whether to continue waiting or to hope the end would come soon enough to be witnessed. And that's the cruel irony. In a system obsessed with control, death was the only exit that still allowed choice. Which brings us to the final stretch. Because once you understand this, that prisoners prayed for death not just to end pain, but to avoid erasure, the question shifts. It's no longer why were medieval prisons so cruel. It becomes why was being forgotten worse than dying. And the answer to that tells us more about medieval society and ourselves than we're usually comfortable admitting. In the next chapter, we're going to close the loop. We'll talk about why this mindset lasted so long, why it faded, and what it quietly passed on to the modern world. This is where everything connects. Here's the part that's easy to miss if you only look at the suffering. Praying for death wasn't just despair, it was strategy. In a place where every choice had been stripped away, death became the only decision prisoners could still imagine controlling. When you can't decide when to eat, sleep, move, speak, or even see light, the idea of choosing an ending feels powerful. Not hopeful, powerful. That's why prayers shifted from save me to take me. It wasn't surrender, it was reclaiming a fragment of agency. And medieval authorities understood this more than they admitted. A prisoner who feared death could be threatened. A prisoner who welcomed it was unpredictable. So the system learned to balance suffering carefully enough to break resistance. Not enough to remove fear completely. Death had to remain distant, not imminent. Shocking fact, some jailers delayed executions. Deliberately, once prisoners stopped resisting, using uncertainty as leverage. This meant death was dangled just out of reach. Close enough to imagine, far enough to hurt. And over time, prisoners internalized this tension. They lived suspended between hoping for release and hoping for an end. That limbo exhausted them more thoroughly than pain ever could. This is where prayer became routine, not emotional, not dramatic, just part of the day. Whispered words into darkness, repeated out of habit. The act of praying mattered more than the outcome. It gave structure where none existed. For many prisoners, God became the only audience left, the only witness, even if he stayed silent. Speaking to someone, anyone, kept them from disappearing completely. Shocking fact, some medieval prisoners prayed aloud even when they no longer believed, just to hear a human voice, their own. And this is where control flipped again. The system believed it owned prisoners' bodies, but it couldn't fully own their inner world. Prayer, thoughts, acceptance of death, these lived beyond chains. So while prisons destroyed bodies, they never fully conquered meaning. That's why records feel haunted, not by screams, but by calm confessions, calm prayers, calm acceptance. It unnerved medieval observers. They wrote about it carefully, almost nervously, because it suggested something dangerous, that the system could crush people, but not fully command them. And that frightened authority, because if death stops being scary, fear loses its grip. Which is why prisons remained places of waiting rather than killing, lingering rather than ending. Time, not execution, did the real work. And here's the quiet truth underneath everything we've talked about so far. Medieval prisoners prayed for death because it was the only thing the system couldn't schedule precisely. It couldn't fully control when or how it arrived. Death stayed just unpredictable enough to feel like freedom. And once you see that, the story isn't just about medieval cruelty anymore. It's about how systems react when people stop fearing the worst thing they can threaten you with. In the next chapter, we're going to look at the legacy of all this, how the mindset survived, evolved, and quietly shaped modern ideas about punishment and suffering. This is where history stops being distant. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The mindset that made prisoners in the 1300s pray for death didn't vanish when medieval prisons disappeared. It just changed clothes. The walls got cleaner, the chains got quieter, but the psychology stayed. Medieval prisons taught institutions something brutally effective. Uncertainty breaks people faster than pain, and once that lesson was learned, it never really got unlearned. You see it again and again through history, not just in prisons, but in ships, asylums, workhouses, even early factories, places designed not to kill quickly, but to wear people down slowly. The Middle Ages didn't invent this, but they perfected it. Shocking fact, by the late medieval period, some prisons were intentionally designed without execution, schedules because unpredictability caused higher compliance. Think about that. Not knowing when or if something will end messes with your sense of time, identity, and hope. Your brain can't settle. You can't prepare. You can't grieve properly. You just wait, comma. And waiting does something strange. It makes death feel less like an enemy and more like a conclusion. Something solid. Something certain. Something you can imagine holding on to. That's exactly the shift medieval prisoners experienced. And it didn't stop with them. Fast forward a few centuries and you'll see the same logic dressed up as reform. Solitary confinement, indefinite detention, life sentences without clear structure, all based on the same assumption. Remove predictability, and people will break inwardly. But here's the twist no one likes to admit. Sometimes they don't break. Sometimes they adapt. An adaptation doesn't look like rebellion. It looks like emotional withdrawal, acceptance, calm. The same calm medieval jailers found disturbing. Shocking fact. Modern prison psychologists still report that inmates serving indeterminate sentences show higher rates of emotional flatness and death fixation. That's not coincidence. That's inheritance. The medieval prisoner praying for death wasn't being dramatic. They were responding logically to an environment designed to erase them slowly. And when you place humans in any system like that, medieval or modern, the brain looks for certainty wherever it can find it. Death is certain. So what we're really seeing isn't some dark quirk of the middle. Ages we're seeing a human response to prolonged powerlessness, and once you realize that, the story shifts again. Because suddenly the question isn't why were they so hopeless back then. It becomes why do we keep building systems that recreate the same mental conditions? Medieval prisons didn't disappear because they were cruel. They disappeared because they were inefficient, too expensive, too chaotic, too uncontrolled, but the core idea that slow erosion works stayed, and it followed us forward. There was a point when society began to feel something unfamiliar about prisons. Discomfort, not outrage, not rebellion, just a quiet, creeping sense that something was wrong in a way that was hard to explain. Medieval prisons hadn't failed because they were too cruel. They failed because people started noticing what they did to the human mind. You see it first in writing. Letters, court notes, religious commentary. The language shifts. Less about punishment, more about damage, less about justice, more about what prison was doing to souls. Shocking fact, by the late 1400s, some clerics openly questioned whether prolonged imprisonment endangered salvation more than execution did. That's a wild thing to admit in a deeply religious society. It meant the system designed to discipline might actually be pushing people further from redemption. And this is where shame enters. Executions were brutal. Yes, but they were honest. Everyone saw them. Everyone acknowledged them. Prisons, on the other hand, hid suffering behind walls. They allowed society to pretend cruelty wasn't happening, even as it continued every day. Once that illusion cracked, prisons became morally awkward, hard to defend, hard to explain, especially when prisoners emerged broken, silent, or not at all. And slowly, quietly, people began asking dangerous questions. Not did they deserve punishment, but did we go too far? That question changed everything, because once you ask it, you can't unask it. Suddenly, long-term confinement, without clarity, looked less like discipline and more like abandonment. The idea that people prayed for death stopped, sounding like weakness, and started sounding like an indictment. Shocking fact, early reform movements didn't aim to reduce suffering. They aimed to reduce invisibility, light, windows, records, schedules, all tiny changes meant to restore something. Prisons had taken predictability. Predictability brings accountability, and accountability brings shame. That's why reforms focused on structure, not kindness. Structure was safer, less emotional, but it acknowledged the problem without naming it directly. And here's the irony. The moment prisons became more organized, death lost some of its power. Not because conditions improved dramatically, but because time stopped being a void. When you can count days, death feels less like the only certainty left. This is when praying for death slowly stopped being common, not because prisoners were suddenly hopeful, but because the system no longer erased them completely. But the damage had already been done. The psychological blueprint was out there now, and future institutions would keep borrowing from it, tweaking it, pretending it was new. So the Middle Ages didn't end this story. They started a conversation humanity is still uncomfortable finishing. Let's go back to that cell one last time. Stone walls sweating with moisture, the floor cold enough to ache, a single shaft of light slipping through a hole that was never meant to give hope, only to remind you that the world still exists somewhere else. Now imagine sitting there long enough that your body adjusts, but your sense of self doesn't. That's the moment prisoners in the 1300s crossed a line we rarely talk about. The moment life stopped feeling like something that belonged to them, when every day looked identical. Pain lost contrast, time stopped moving forward, and existence became maintenance instead of meaning. In that state, death didn't feel dramatic. Shocking fact, medieval accounts describe prisoners greeting the idea of death with relief rather than fear, a psychological response now associated with extreme long-term confinement, because life in those cells wasn't just hard, it was suspended. No milestones, no progression, no future to imagine, and humans aren't built to live without forward motion. We can endure pain, we can endure hunger. What breaks us is endlessness. Endlessness is what turned hope inward until it collapsed. That's why death became attractive. Not because prisoners wanted to stop breathing, but because death promised an ending. A boundary, a full stop, something prison refused to give. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. This wasn't an accident. Medieval prisons weren't designed to rehabilitate. They weren't even designed to punish efficiently. They were designed to hold, to remove people from society and let time do the damage quietly. Prisoners praying for death weren't failures of faith. They were evidence the system worked exactly as intended. Shocking fact. Some medieval legal texts openly state that imprisonment should weigh upon the soul, rather than the body. That tells you everything. And when you zoom out, the story stops being medieval. It becomes human. Put anyone in a place where identity dissolves, time loses meaning, and choice disappears, and the brain will search for certainty wherever it can find it. Death is certain. That's why this story still matters. Not because medieval prisons were uniquely cruel, but because they revealed something uncomfortable about how humans respond to power, control, and waiting. We like to believe progress fixed this, that we're kinder now, smarter, more humane, but every time a system relies on uncertainty to break people, every time waiting becomes the punishment. Every time lives are put on pause without clarity, this story repeats itself. Different walls, same psychology. So when prisoners in the 1300s prayed for death, they weren't asking for darkness. They were asking for relief from endlessness, from invisibility, from a life that no longer moved forward. And that should force us to ask a final question, not about them, but about us. If death felt kinder than life back then, what does that say about any system where people still feel the same today? There's a detail most records never mention. After the prayers stopped, after the whispers faded, after the prisoner finally went quiet, the cell didn't change. The walls stayed wet. The light still slipped through that tiny hole. The prison moved on like nothing happened. That silence is the real ending of this story, because no one rushed in to mark the moment. No one paused to ask what it took for a human being to reach a place where death felt like kindness. The system absorbed the body and erased the question. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. Prisoners in the 1300s didn't pray for death because they were weak. They prayed because they had reached the edge of what a human mind can endure when life becomes endless waiting, when hope turns into a memory, when existing hurts more than stopping. Their prayers weren't dramatic. They were quiet, practical, almost calm, and that calm should scare us, because it tells us something timeless. When people stop begging for freedom and start asking for an ending, the system has already failed, no matter how legal, orderly, or justified it claims to be. History likes to soften this, to turn it into a medieval curiosity. Dark, distant, safely finished. But it isn't finished. Not really. The moment we build places where time is weaponized, where uncertainty replaces justice, where humans are reduced to waiting, we recreate that cell. We recreate that prayer. Different century, same silence. So when you hear the phrase, "they prayed for death," don't imagine despair. Imagine clarity. Imagine someone who finally understood there would be no rescue, no meaning, no forward motion, and chose the only certainty left. That's not a medieval problem. That's a human one. And maybe the real lesson isn't about how cruel the past was. Maybe it's about how easy it is to repeat it quietly. If this story stayed with you longer than you expected, then the prisoners weren't forgotten after all. They were finally heard. Thanks for watching.